He slammed the folder down so hard the table rattled. "Fix it," Trump barked, voice raw. "Now!" Across the mahogany conference table, 4 of his top legal advisers shifted uncomfortably, their faces pale, their phones buzzing relentlessly with alerts they didn't dare check. In the courtroom just 1 floor below, Judge Pamela Whitaker had just detonated the day. An emergency ruling issued live, blindsiding the entire team. Nobody had seen it coming. Not the aides glued to their sources, not the lawyers who had predicted smooth sailing, not Trump himself, who had swaggered into the courthouse with a smirk, like a man walking into a victory parade. But something shifted, silently, fatally. And now, less than 20 minutes later, the air inside the conference room felt thick enough to choke on. "Who gave her the green light?" Trump demanded, his voice a low snarl. "Who the hell missed this?" No one answered. Outside, reporters massed like a living tide. Inside, the walls pressed closer. A single headline had already broken across every major network. Judge Whitaker's shock ruling. Direct hit on Trump legal team. And it was just the beginning. It started, as these days often did, with a joke. "Maybe I'll bring popcorn," Trump said that morning, striding through the marbled lobby of the federal courthouse. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted. He grinned like he was stepping onto a late-night talk show set rather than into a legal battlefield. His lawyers chuckled dutifully. A few whispered among themselves, passing around fresh polls showing his approval ratings holding steady, if not rising slightly, among his base. The general mood was bullish. Another witch hunt to swat down, another technicality to outmaneuver. Inside the private entrance, an aide handed him a tightly summarized court schedule. Trump's eyes skimmed it, uninterested. "Delay game," he muttered under his breath. "They're stalling." In truth, it had looked that way. Multiple postponements, motions buried under motions, enough procedural quicksand to make real consequences feel distant, abstract. Trump wore his favorite navy blue suit, tailored to command, with the trademark red tie knotted aggressively tight. His walk had the unmistakable rhythm of a man certain the day would end with him victorious. Or, at worst, unchanged. What none of them noticed, not the aides, not the lawyers, not Trump himself, were the details. The court staffers moving slightly faster than usual. The clerks whispering in urgent tones instead of casual small talk. The chief bailiff repeatedly checking his earpiece. Tiny disruptions in the usual solemn choreography of federal court proceedings. Inside the courtroom, the audience gathered. Journalists, law clerks, curious citizens. The temperature was cool, the lighting sterile. The judge's bench sat still, silent, towering like a monolith. Justice Pamela Whitaker's chair remained empty, for now. Trump leaned over to one of his attorneys, whispering with a smirk, "Bet she doesn't even show." A few scattered laughs answered him. The hearing was supposed to be procedural, a quick status update, a formality, nothing dangerous. Or so they thought. The minutes dragged lazily by, the audience growing restless. Phones buzzed against thighs and handbags, texts coming in, news alerts flickering. Nothing unusual, not yet. Then the doors at the side of the courtroom opened, without announcement, without warning. Justice Whitaker entered not with a gavel in hand, but with a manila folder tucked tightly under her arm. She walked straight to the bench, face unreadable, and sat. The room noticed first what was missing. No preliminary remarks, no polite greetings, no banter about scheduling. Instead, she adjusted her glasses once, opened the folder, and spoke. "This court has determined that new material facts, relevant to executive conduct and compliance with standing orders, require immediate judicial intervention." A ripple of confusion passed through the room. Trump's lead counsel stiffened visibly. Whitaker continued, voice like glass cutting through steel. Accordingly, this hearing will no longer proceed as scheduled. This bench is now convened for emergency review under Article 3 authority. Trump shifted in his chair, the easy swagger leaking out of his posture like air from a punctured balloon. He turned slightly, catching the concerned glance of his attorneys. His face twitched, a tiny frown creasing the lines beneath his eyes. "What the hell is this?" he muttered, low enough only for those closest to hear. No answer came. Whitaker kept speaking, methodically unfolding the legal nightmare. Allegations of executive defiance, constitutional breach, material evidence of obstruction. Words that had been rumors just days ago were now being read into record, framed not as accusations, but as certainties. The air thinned, the stakes sharpened, and for the first time in months, maybe years, Donald John Trump looked uncertain inside a courtroom. Outside, the sky began to darken, early storm clouds gathering at the edges of the skyline. Inside, history shifted on silent hinges, and the collapse had just begun. The courtroom, once bustling with whispers and clicks of camera shutters, now sat paralyzed in perfect stillness. Even the air seemed to resist movement, heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. Judge Whitaker didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Each word landed with the finality of a closing vault. "This court has reviewed verified communications indicating attempts to circumvent judicial authority in active litigation concerning executive actions," she said. Trump leaned in, one hand gripping the defense table so tightly that the leather pad beneath his palm wrinkled. Whitaker reached for the gavel, but instead of striking it to open a formal hearing, she held it loosely in one hand, almost as a warning. "This bench," she said, "hereby issues an emergency injunction, effective immediately. The office of the former president is ordered to cease all administrative directives relating to immigration enforcement, pending full review." The words detonated through the chamber. There was no warning, no briefing, no arguments heard, just a ruling. Swift, surgical, absolute. Trump blinked once, twice, the realization hitting slower than the room around him. Across the aisle, members of the press furiously scribbled notes, their faces transforming from confusion to open shock. The lead attorney for Trump's team, a graying man named Leonard Vance, rose clumsily to object, but Whitaker cut him off with a single curt motion of her hand. "This is not a request for debate," she said. "It is a preservation of jurisdiction." Trump stood abruptly, his chair skidding a few inches backward with an awful screech. His face flushed a deep, angry red. "This is outrageous!" he barked, voice echoing against the marble walls. "You can't do this!" Whitaker didn't flinch. "This court not only can," she replied coolly, "it just did." The murmur that rose in the gallery was immediate and uncontrollable, like the first gust of a breaking storm. One of Trump's aides, a young man with nervous eyes and trembling hands, slipped from the courtroom in a barely concealed sprint, cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. Trump turned sharply toward Vance. "Move to vacate," he snapped, voice low but deadly. Vance hesitated, just long enough to be noticed. Whitaker, still calm, continued speaking over the gathering tremors in the room. "Furthermore," she said, "this court will convene a special evidentiary hearing within 72 hours to address allegations of executive non-compliance with constitutional mandates." She paused, allowing the weight of her words to fall like bricks onto the defense table. "Attendance for the defendant," she said, looking directly at Trump for the first time that morning, "is not optional." The courtroom exhaled, a single jagged breath, as Trump sat slowly back down, the blood draining visibly from his face. The trapdoor had opened, and for the first time in living memory, it was Donald Trump standing on it. Outside, lightning flickered silently against the heavy gray sky. Inside, a presidency, or the ghost of one, teetered on the edge of collapse. The door slammed so violently behind him that a framed certificate on the wall tilted precariously. Trump stormed into the private conference room, his legal team scrambling to follow. Papers scattered as aides threw down folders, searching for answers none of them had. Trump's face was a mask of rage, jaw tight, eyes burning. "What the hell was that?" he roared. Leonard Vance, already sweating through his collar, tried to keep his voice steady. "Sir, we weren't notified of any emergency hearing. This was entirely—" Trump slammed his hand against the table. "I don't care about your excuses. You told me this was locked up." Vance stumbled through a response, but Trump wasn't listening. He turned on a younger attorney, fresh out of some Ivy League school, who had dared to suggest filing a preemptive motion last week. "You said Whitaker wouldn't dare," Trump spat. "You said they were too scared to touch me." The young man opened his mouth, then shut it, his face drained of color. Trump paced furiously, hands clenching and unclenching. Every few steps he would whip around, glaring at the faces in the room as if daring one of them to challenge him. Phones buzzed non-stop on the table, notifications stacking up like wreckage. Breaking. Trump's authority curtailed by federal judge. Unprecedented injunction rocks. Former president's legal team. Special hearing ordered. Trump compelled to testify. Trump snatched one of the phones, scanned the headlines, then threw it across the room. It hit the far wall with a hollow thud and shattered, screen splintering into a spider web of cracks. "I want a stay filed. I want a motion to dismiss. I want appeals." Each demand came like a whip crack. Vance nodded weakly, signaling to a paralegal already frantically drafting emergency paperwork. But everyone in the room knew this wasn't a battle they were ready for. Trump stopped pacing and pointed a trembling finger at the door. "Get me out of here," he said, voice lower now, almost growling. "Get me a statement, something. I'm not sitting here like a damn sitting duck." Another aide stepped forward cautiously. "Sir," he said, "the media's already outside. Cameras everywhere." "So what?" Trump snapped. The aide hesitated. "They're not here for a rally. They're here for the collapse." Trump's face twisted. Not just anger now, but something deeper. Fear. For the first time, the unspoken reality filled the room like smoke. This wasn't just another bad news cycle. This wasn't another bad faith prosecution he could shrug off. This was different. This was real. Vance, gathering his courage, spoke again, softer. "Sir, with all due respect, they blindsided us because they had the authority to do it. Judge Whitaker isn't bluffing. We're already 2 moves behind." Trump said nothing. He stood still, breathing heavily, staring at the scattered papers, the broken phone, the ashen faces of his advisers. Outside, the first rumble of thunder echoed through the thick air. Inside, a storm had already broken, and Trump was trapped in the center of it. He turned slowly back to the table. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, but it was no less dangerous. "Then we don't fight fair," he said. "We fight like hell." He straightened his tie, ran a hand through his hair, and marched toward the door, leaving behind the broken glass, the ruined phone, and the last shreds of the confidence he'd worn into court that morning. Because if there was one thing Donald Trump had learned over a lifetime of battles, it was this: when the walls started closing in, you didn't negotiate. You detonated, and he was just getting started. Back in the courtroom, the energy had shifted from shock to solemnity. Every seat filled, every eye locked forward. Even the reporters had stopped typing, frozen mid-keystroke, as Judge Whitaker adjusted the microphone before her. She didn't smile. She didn't clear her throat. She simply leaned in and spoke. Calm, clear, unstoppable. "This bench did not seek this confrontation," she said, "but it cannot retreat from it." Her voice was steady, the kind that doesn't need to rise to command the room. The Constitution spoke through her tone, not her volume. "The events of the past 72 hours reveal not a misunderstanding of law," she continued, "but a deliberate erosion of it." A hush fell so thick that the soft whir of ceiling fans above was suddenly deafening. Whitaker laid out the facts. Unauthorized executive actions taken after court injunctions, public statements undermining judicial authority, disregard for pending litigation, and soon, most critically, the open defiance of binding orders. She didn't rant. She didn't accuse. She diagnosed. "In this nation," she said, her gaze sweeping the room, "power is not self-regulating. It is not self-correcting. Power unchecked becomes presumption, and presumption left unchallenged becomes tyranny." You could feel the weight of history stacking up behind each word. In the gallery, some leaned forward without realizing it. In the defense table, Trump's lawyers sat motionless, pale. Judge Whitaker lifted a single document, a thin sheaf of paper clipped in the top corner. "This," she said, holding it high, "is the emergency order issued by this court." She placed it gently on the bench, the soft slap of paper on wood sounding louder than a gunshot in the silence. "It does not call for interpretation. It does not seek applause. It demands compliance." Her gaze finally landed, directly, squarely, unmistakably, on Trump. "You, sir, chose not just to defy this court," she said, "but to mock it, to reduce constitutional guardianship to spectacle." No one moved. No one breathed. Whitaker paused, letting the silence underline the moment. "The rule of law," she said, her voice lower now, colder, "is not a set piece to be applauded or ignored at will. It is the scaffold upon which this republic stands." And then, the final line, delivered with no fanfare, no drama, just pure consequence. "Today, this court reaffirms that no individual, regardless of title, wealth, or past service, stands immune from its reach." The gavel didn't fall. It didn't have to. The words themselves closed the first chapter of a reckoning that had just begun. By the time Trump left the courthouse, head down, jaw set, storming through a gauntlet of flashing cameras, the news had already detonated nationwide. Cable networks cleared their schedules. News apps lit up phones in vibrating waves. Pundits scrambled to their sets in a frenzy of breathless analysis. Within hours, the headlines were everywhere. Shock ruling. Trump subpoenaed for special hearing. Federal court slams. Trump with emergency injunction. Former president ordered to testify under oath. Across Washington, D.C., the ripple effect was immediate and brutal. By noon, congressional leaders were huddling in urgent closed-door meetings. Senior figures in Trump's political apparatus were issuing vague, non-committal statements. Even usually, loyal networks began inserting disclaimers, allegations under review, unprecedented judicial action. Inside the Trump camp, the panic was less visible, but far more vicious. Aides circulated frantic memos about media strategy. Emergency conference calls buzzed back and forth. Lawyers disagreed bitterly and publicly over next moves. Should they appeal, attack the judge, stall for time? Trump himself remained largely silent, not because he had no words, but because the words he needed didn't exist anymore. The old playbook, deny, deflect, dominate, didn't fit the scale of this collapse. Even his most ardent allies, sensing the seismic shift, began stepping carefully around his name in interviews, treating him less like a king under siege and more like a crumbling relic. Out on the streets, the public reaction was mixed, but intense. In some places, crowds gathered spontaneously outside courthouses and government buildings, holding up copies of the Constitution like shields. In others, protests bloomed, angered by what they saw as judicial overreach or political targeting. But one thing was undeniable. The country wasn't ignoring this. It was watching, and watching closely. And in that scrutiny, raw, electric, relentless, the real damage grew. Because even Trump's strongest weapon, the ability to dominate narrative, to twist every defeat into a battle cry, was faltering. The story wasn't spinning his way. The judges, the cameras, the country itself, all seemed to have shifted their gaze from spectacle to substance, from theater to accountability. And Trump, a man who once filled arenas by the tens of thousands, now found himself battling a courtroom microphone, a judge's steady voice, and a nation that for once seemed unwilling to follow his script. He refused to go down quietly. By early evening, as storm clouds dragged across the D.C. skyline like bruises, Trump's team hastily organized a press conference inside a crumbling ballroom at a second-tier hotel. No marble columns, no grand stage, just a cheap wooden podium slapped together between frantic phone calls and trembling staffers. The crowd was thin. A few loyalists, a smattering of low-tier media outlets, and cameras positioned at awkward angles. When Trump walked in, he still tried for the old swagger, shoulders back, chin high, red tie slicing down his chest like a battle standard. But the weight of the day clung to him, heavier than any tailored jacket could conceal. He gripped the sides of the podium so tightly, the microphone trembled. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice rougher than usual, "what we witnessed today was not justice, it was political theater." He launched into the familiar rhythm, attacking Judge Whitaker as a partisan disgrace, accusing the courts of trying to steal the people's will, declaring himself the true defender of American sovereignty. But something was missing. The energy, the inevitability, the magnetism. It was all thinner now, stretched taut over the cracks forming beneath him. Reporters barely flinched at the accusations. Even his most ardent supporters, the few who had shown up, shifted uneasily at the back of the room. Midway through, Trump pulled out a sheaf of papers on hastily prepared legal filings. "We are filing a lawsuit against Judge Whitaker personally for abuse of power," he thundered. A few gasps from the crowd, a few scattered claps, but no roar, no momentum. The claim was laughable, legally incoherent, politically desperate, and everyone knew it. The cameras caught it all, the trembling hands, the hollow ring of applause, the faint sheen of sweat on Trump's brow. By the time he finished speaking, after 30 rumbled minutes of grievances and half-formed threats, the room felt more like a wake than a rally. As he exited through the side door, an aide whispered urgently in his ear. Another ruling was coming, tonight, from the Supreme Court. Not an appeal, not a stay, a final nail. Trump said nothing. He simply kept walking, shoulders slightly hunched, the storm outside finally catching him. Night fell heavy over Washington. At 10:41 p.m., the Supreme Court quietly released its response. A single-page order, unsigned but unanimous. It upheld Judge Whitaker's injunction. It demanded full compliance. It reaffirmed the emergency hearing. The language was stark, brutal in its simplicity. No individual is exempt from constitutional constraint, regardless of past or present title. No televised addresses, no late-night tweets. The account handlers had fallen silent. No fiery rebuttals, just silence. And across the country, the silence spoke louder than any press conference could. In law schools, professors printed out the emergency ruling and pinned it to classroom walls. In homes, families sat stunned as anchors read the full text live on air, voice by voice. In the corridors of power, lawmakers recalibrated, allies backing slowly away, enemies circling with sharpened knives. Trump, for once, was simply absent. No rallies, no interviews, no triumphant exit. He became a ghost moving through his own crumbling empire. A man whose defiance, once cheered, had been weighed, measured, and finally stopped, not by political opponents, but by the very system he had once sworn to protect. Justice Whitaker didn't hold a press conference. She didn't need to. Her ruling was already everywhere. T-shirts, murals, viral tweets, quoted in courthouse steps and late-night monologues alike. One line, especially, became the echo that refused to fade. Power unchecked becomes presumption, and presumption left unchallenged becomes tyranny. In the weeks that followed, hearings proceeded. More revelations surfaced, more consequences followed, but it was that moment, the moment when a gavel silenced a roar, that endured. Not because it was loud, not because it was brutal, but because it was right. The Constitution hadn't shouted, it hadn't marched, it had simply stood still and let defiance break itself against it. And in the end, history remembered not the anger, not the noise, not the spectacle. It remembered the silence of a court that refused to bend, the silence of a nation that finally refused to look away, the silence of a man realizing, too late, that the stage he had once dominated was not his to own. It never had been, and it never would be. Gavel, echo, memory.